Alone in the wilderness, miles from any soul, a man who'd given up on the world broke through a wall of stone that hadn't been touched in over a century, and behind it, stacked floor to ceiling in a cave carved by desperate hands, was $312 million in gold bars that would force him to face everything he'd run from. Before we explore this incredible true story, make sure to smash subscribe, because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The Colorado Rockies don't forgive mistakes. At 11,000 feet, where the air thins and the pine trees grow twisted from constant wind, the mountains test every soul who dares to call them home. Marcus Hayes had been tested for 7 years, and somehow he was still standing. His cabin sat tucked in a narrow valley, hidden so well that even the park rangers had forgotten it existed. Built with his own hands from timber he'd felled and stones he'd hauled, it was more fortress than home. 1 room, barely 400 square feet, with a wood stove that burned through the long winters and a single window facing east to catch the morning sun. No electricity, no running water, no neighbors for 15 miles in any direction. Just silence, deep, endless silence. Marcus was 43 years old, though the mountains had aged him beyond his years. His beard hung thick, and gray streaked down to his chest. His hands were calloused and scarred from years of splitting wood and hauling water. His eyes, once bright with ambition and hope, had gone flat and distant, like stones smoothed by a cold river. He hadn't always lived this way. There was a time when Marcus Hayes had been someone entirely different. A mining engineer with degrees from the Colorado School of Mines, he'd worked for one of the largest extraction companies in the western United States. He'd worn suits to meetings. He'd flown to conferences. He'd owned a house in Denver with a 2-car garage and a lawn he mowed every Saturday. He'd had a wife, Emily, dark hair that caught the light just right, a laugh that could fill a room. She'd been a teacher, 3rd grade, and she'd loved those kids like they were her own, and they'd had a daughter, Sophie, 7 years old, with her mother's eyes and a gap-toothed smile that made Marcus believe, truly believe, that life could be good. But that was before the accident, before the night that split his life into 2 halves, the one where he was a husband and a father, and the one where he was nothing at all. It happened on a Friday in late October, 7 years ago. Marcus had been working late at the Denver office, reviewing safety reports for a new extraction site. Emily had taken Sophie to a friend's birthday party across town. They were driving home on I-25 when a drunk driver crossed the median, doing 80 miles per hour. The police said they died instantly. They said it like that was supposed to be a comfort. Marcus had identified the bodies. He'd planned the funeral. He'd stood in a black suit while people he barely knew told him how sorry they were, how tragic it all was, how time would heal. But time didn't heal. Time just accumulated like sediment, layer upon layer of gray days that all felt the same. He tried to go back to work. Lasted 3 months. He'd sit in meetings about drill efficiency and profit margins, and all he could think about was how none of it mattered, how Sophie would never grow up, how Emily would never laugh again, how he was sitting in an air-conditioned office talking about tonnage while his family was in the ground. So he quit, sold the house, sold the car, sold everything that reminded him of the life that had been stolen from him. He bought supplies, hiking gear, tools, and drove until the roads ran out. Then he walked until even the trails disappeared, and he built a cabin in a place where no one would ever find him. For 7 years, Marcus had lived by a rhythm, so simple it required no thought. Wake before dawn, check the trap line, haul water from the creek, split firewood, tend the small garden in summer, hunt when meat ran low, read by candlelight the few books he'd brought with him, sleep. He spoke to no one, he saw no one. Sometimes, months would pass without him hearing a human voice other than his own. And that was exactly what he wanted. The morning of August 17th started like any other. Marcus woke to the pale grey light filtering through the cabin's single window. He dressed in layers, flannel shirt, wool vest, canvas jacket. The altitude meant even summer mornings carried a bite. He stepped outside and immediately smelled it. Storm coming. The air had that metallic tang that meant lightning, and the wind had shifted, blowing hard from the west. Dark clouds were already piling up over the peaks, moving fast. Marcus moved quickly. He checked that the firewood was stacked under the overhang. He secured the shutters on the window. He brought in extra water from the creek, filling every bucket and pot he owned. Mountain storms could be brutal, and the last thing he needed was to be caught outside when it hit. By noon, the first drops were falling. By 1, the sky had turned the color of bruised steel, and rain was coming down in sheets. Thunder rolled through the valley like artillery fire, and lightning split the darkness with stark white cracks that left afterimages burned into Marcus's vision. He sat inside, listening to the storm hammer the roof. The wind howled through the pines, bending them nearly horizontal. This was a big one, the kind that reshaped the landscape. Around 3 in the afternoon, there was a sound different from the thunder. A deep, grinding crack, followed by a rumble that shook the cabin's foundation. Marcus stood, heart suddenly pounding. That wasn't thunder. That was rock. Landslide. He grabbed his rain gear and stepped out into the storm. The rain hit him like a wall, instantly soaking through to his skin despite the oilcloth coat. He squinted through the downpour, trying to see where the sound had come from. There, to the north, maybe half a mile up the valley, where the ridge rose steep and rocky, a section of the cliff face had given way. He could see the raw brown scar where tons of stone had sheared off and tumbled down. Marcus knew he should stay inside, but something pulled at him. Maybe it was simple curiosity. Maybe it was the fact that after 7 years of the same routine, anything different felt significant. Or maybe, deep down, some part of him still remembered what it was like to be an engineer, to be the kind of man who investigated when the earth moved. He started walking. The rain pummeled him. Water ran in streams down the rocky slope, turning every depression into a temporary creek. His boots sank into mud with each step. Lightning flashed so close he could smell the ozone, and thunder followed so quickly it felt like a physical blow. But Marcus kept climbing. It took him nearly an hour to reach the landslide. The storm was finally beginning to ease, the rain tapering to a steady drizzle, the thunder moving east. He stood at the base of the slide, breathing hard, his legs burning from the climb. The collapsed section was massive. Tons of granite and shale had peeled away from the cliff face, exposing fresh rock beneath. And there, about 20 feet up from where Marcus stood, something caught his eye. An opening, not a natural crack or fissure. This was different. This was shaped, rectangular, man-made. Marcus's heart began to beat faster. His engineer's mind kicked in, reading the rock face the way another man might read a book. The opening had been deliberately covered. Someone had stacked stones across it, sealing it shut. And based on the weathering patterns, based on how the lichen had grown over the covering stones, this had been sealed for a very long time. Decades, maybe a century. He scrambled up the loose scree, feet slipping, hands grabbing for purchase. When he reached the opening, he peered inside. Darkness. The hole was maybe 3 feet wide and 4 feet tall. Beyond the threshold, he could see nothing but black. Marcus pulled a flashlight from his coat pocket. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rough-hewn stone walls. This wasn't a natural cave. This was a mine shaft. An old one, hand-carved. Probably from the 1800s when gold fever had driven men into every mountain and valley in Colorado. He should leave. He should mark the location and hike back to the cabin before dark. This was dangerous. Old mine shafts were notorious for bad air, unstable ceilings, and hidden drops. But Marcus didn't leave. Because standing there at the threshold of that dark opening, he felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Curiosity, purpose, the pull of the unknown. He squeezed through the opening. Inside, the air was cool and dry. The shaft extended straight back into the mountain, the walls showing tool marks from pickaxes and drilling. The ceiling was low. Marcus had to duck, but it was solid, reinforced with old timber beams that had somehow survived the decades. He moved forward slowly, flashlight beams sweeping left and right. The shaft ran about 30 feet, then opened into a larger chamber. Marcus stepped into it and stopped dead. His flashlight illuminated what lay before him, but his brain struggled to process it. The chamber was roughly 15 feet square, carved from solid rock. The ceiling rose to maybe 8 feet at its highest point, and filling the space, stacked in neat rows that reached nearly to the ceiling, were gold bars. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. They gleamed dully in the flashlight beam, each one stamped with markings Marcus couldn't quite make out from where he stood. They were stacked on crude wooden pallets, organized with almost military precision. Marcus took a step forward, then another. His hands were shaking. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. He reached out and touched the nearest bar. The metal was cold, solid, real. He picked it up. It was heavy, easily 25 pounds. Standard gold bar weight. On the top surface, he could see the stamping now. A date, 1876, and a mark he didn't recognize. Some kind of official seal. He set the bar down carefully and backed up, trying to count the stacks. His mind, trained in estimation and calculation, started working automatically. 10 stacks across, 8 stacks deep, each stack roughly 12 bars high. That was 960 bars visible from this angle. But there were more stacks behind those, deeper in the chamber. Maybe 15 rows total. His breath came faster. 15 rows of 80 bars each, 1,200 bars. At 25 pounds per bar, 30,000 pounds of gold. At current market prices, because even after 7 years in the wilderness, Marcus still remembered that gold was trading at around $1,800 per ounce, that was. His knees went weak. He sat down hard on the cave floor. Over $500 million. No, he must have counted wrong. He stood up, shining the light more carefully, counting again. But the number kept coming out the same. Maybe not quite 500 million. Maybe 400 million. Maybe 300 million, if some of the stacks were smaller than they appeared. But it was still an incomprehensible fortune, sitting in an abandoned mine shaft, in the middle of nowhere. Marcus's mind raced. Where had this come from? How long had it been here? Who had sealed it up? And why? He moved deeper into the chamber, examining the walls. There, on the far side, he found what he was looking for. Carved directly into the stone, crude but legible. Consolidated Mining Company, 1876, secured by order below. That, scratched in a different hand, less formal. God help whoever finds this. It cost us everything. Marcus stood there, reading and rereading those words. A story was unfolding in his mind. The 1870s, the height of the Colorado gold rush, mining companies pulling fortunes from the mountains. And then, what? An ambush, a robbery, a decision to hide the gold rather than risk transporting it. Whatever had happened, someone had sealed this chamber with the intention of coming back, but they never had. And over the decades, the location had been forgotten, buried under landslides and erosion, and the simple passage of time, until a storm on an August afternoon had torn away the final layer of stone and exposed it once again. Marcus sat down on one of the wooden pallets. His hands were still shaking. His heart hammered in his chest. For 7 years, he'd lived in isolation, wanting nothing from the world, asking nothing from anyone. He'd been content, or at least, he'd been numb enough to pass for content. And now this impossible discovery that changed everything. Because he couldn't just leave it here. Could he? This wasn't his gold. It belonged to who? The mining company was long defunct. The men who'd hidden it were over a century dead. Did it belong to the state? To the federal government? To whoever happened to stumble across it? Marcus ran his hands through his wet hair. Water dripped from his beard. His clothes were soaked through, and he was starting to shiver as the adrenaline wore off. He needed to think. He needed to make a plan. But first, he needed to get out of this cave and back to the cabin before hypothermia set in. He stood, took one last look at the impossible treasure surrounding him, and made his way back through the shaft. Outside, the storm had passed. The sky was clearing from the east, and late afternoon sunlight was breaking through the clouds, illuminating the valley in shafts of gold that felt almost mocking. Marcus climbed down from the landslide and started the long walk back to the cabin. With every step, his mind churned. What was he supposed to do with this? Who could he tell? Who could he trust? And underneath all of those questions ran a deeper current, one he barely wanted to acknowledge. What if this was meant to be? What if, after 7 years of punishment and isolation, fate or God or simple random chance had put this in his path for a reason? He shook his head, trying to clear it. That was dangerous thinking. He'd learned long ago that the universe didn't hand out gifts. It only took things away. But still, $300 million. Maybe more. Enough to change lives. Enough to save a town. Enough to maybe, possibly, help him find some kind of redemption for all the years he'd wasted hiding from a world that had hurt him. By the time Marcus reached the cabin, the sun was setting. He stripped off his wet clothes, started a fire in the stove, and made coffee with hands that still trembled slightly. He sat at his small wooden table, the same table where he'd eaten alone for 7 years, and stared into the flames. Outside, the last light faded from the sky. The mountains went dark, and Marcus Hayes, the man who'd run from everything, realized he was about to have to run toward something instead. Because ready or not, his isolation was over. The world had just crashed back into his life in the form of stacked gold bars and impossible choices. And there was no way he could ignore it. Not this time. He thought about Emily and Sophie. He thought about the 7 years he'd spent punishing himself for surviving when they hadn't. He thought about the message carved in stone. It cost us everything. Maybe that was the truth about treasure. It always cost something. The question was whether what you gained was worth what you had to pay. Marcus finished his coffee as full dark settled over the valley. Tomorrow, he would go back to the cave. He would examine it more carefully, document it, try to understand the full scope of what he'd found. And then, somehow, he would have to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. The man who stayed hidden in the mountains, keeping the secret until he died? Or the man who faced the world again, with all its dangers and disappointments, and slim possibilities of redemption? He went to bed that night with no answers, only the weight of the decision pressing down on him, like all that gold stacked to the ceiling in a cave he'd never been looking for. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Marcus woke before sunrise, same as always, but nothing felt the same. The routine that had sustained him for 7 years felt suddenly hollow. He dressed quickly, barely tasting the oatmeal he cooked for breakfast, his mind already back at the cave. He gathered supplies, extra rope, his climbing gear, a better flashlight, a notebook and pencil, a camera he'd kept packed away and hadn't used in years. If he was going to do this, he needed to do it right. He needed documentation, evidence, proof that he wasn't losing his mind. The hike, back to the landslide, took less time in daylight. The storm had washed the trail clean, and the air was crisp with that particular clarity that comes after heavy rain. Birds called from the pines. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals up the ridge face. Marcus reached the exposed cave entrance just after 8 in the morning. In full daylight, it looked less dramatic than it had during the storm. Just a dark hole in the cliff face, partially hidden by tumbled rocks. Easy to miss if you didn't know it was there. He climbed up, squeezed through the opening, and turned on his flashlight. The shaft looked exactly as he remembered. He moved through it quickly, heart rate increasing with each step, until he emerged into the main chamber. The gold was still there. Of course, it was still there. Where would it have gone? But seeing it again, in the steadier beam of his better flashlight, made it somehow more real. This wasn't a fever dream. This wasn't his imagination playing tricks after too long alone. This was real gold, real treasure, real trouble. Marcus spent the next 2 hours methodically documenting everything. He took photographs from every angle. He counted the stack's 17 rows, each containing an average of 72 bars. 1,224 bars total. He did the math 3 times, to be sure. At £25 per bar, at current gold prices, he was looking at somewhere between $300 million and $320 million, depending on purity and market fluctuations. 312 million. That number kept coming back to him. He examined the stamps on multiple bars. Most showed the same date, 1876. Some had additional markings. C, M, C, probably for Consolidated Mining Company. Others had numbers that might have been serial codes or weight specifications. He studied the carved messages on the walls more carefully. Besides the main inscription, he found other scratches and marks. Initials: J, W, T, B, M, L. Names of the men who'd hidden this, probably. Men who'd planned to come back and never did. On the floor near the back wall, partially hidden beneath one of the pallets, Marcus found something else. A leather satchel, rotted and crumbling but still recognizable. He carefully opened it. Inside were papers, so old and delicate they nearly fell apart at his touch, but he could make out enough to understand what he was looking at. Shipping manifests, payroll records, a letter on official company stationery. The letter was dated September 15, 1876, and it detailed a plan to move the gold from the mountain to Denver. But something had gone wrong. The letter broke off mid-sentence. The ink smeared, as if the writer had been interrupted. Marcus sat back on his heels. The story was becoming clearer. The Consolidated Mining Company had struck it rich. They'd amassed this fortune and planned to ship it to the city. But something had happened. Maybe an attack by bandits, maybe a betrayal from within. Whatever it was, they'd made the desperate decision to hide the gold, seal the chamber, and wait for a safer time. That time had never come. The men involved had died or disappeared. The company had folded, and the gold had waited in darkness for 147 years, until a storm tore away its hiding place. Marcus carefully photographed the documents, then returned them to the satchel. He couldn't take them with him. They were too fragile. But he needed evidence that this was legitimate, that he hadn't somehow stumbled onto stolen property or something connected to modern crime. As he worked, a question kept nagging at him. What was he going to do with this information? He couldn't just walk into the nearest town and announce he'd found 300 million in gold. That would bring every treasure hunter, criminal, and opportunist in the country. It would bring lawyers and government agents, and probably armed men willing to kill for a share. But he also couldn't just leave it here. Now that the entrance was exposed, it was only a matter of time before someone else found it. A hiker, a hunter, hell, a drone, flying survey patterns. No, he had to do something. He had to make a choice. Marcus spent another hour in the cave, taking more photos, making notes, trying to figure out angles he hadn't considered. Finally, as the sun passed its peak and began its descent toward afternoon, he made his way back out. He stood at the entrance, looking down at the valley below. Somewhere beyond those ridges, maybe 15 miles as the crow flew, was a town, Pine Ridge. Marcus had passed through it once, 7 years ago, on his way up into the mountains. It had been small then, dying even. A handful of buildings clustered around a 2-lane highway, boarded up storefronts, a population that had probably dropped below 200. Places like Pine Ridge were vanishing all across the rural West. The mines had closed, the logging had stopped, the young people left for cities and never came back. What remained were the old, the stubborn, and the desperate, trying to hold onto a way of life that was slowly fading into history. Marcus had a crazy thought. What if this gold, this impossible fortune, could change that? What if instead of hiding it or hoarding it or letting the government lock it away in some vault, it could actually do some good? He shook his head. That was naive thinking. That was the kind of idealism that got people hurt or killed. But the thought wouldn't leave him. He carefully covered the cave entrance with loose rocks, making it look as natural as possible. It wouldn't fool a determined searcher, but it might buy him time. Then he began the hike back to his cabin, his mind working through scenarios, possibilities, and the massive complications that came with each one. As he walked, Marcus realized something that made his chest tighten. For the first time in 7 years, he was thinking about the future, not just tomorrow or next week, but months and years ahead. He was making plans. He was imagining outcomes. He was, against all his instincts and all his experience, beginning to hope, and that terrified him more than anything else. For 3 days, Marcus stayed at the cabin, pacing like a caged animal. He'd heat water for coffee and forget to drink it. He'd start to read a book and realize he hadn't turned a page in 20 minutes. His mind kept circling back to that cave, to the impossible weight of gold stacked in the darkness, to the choice that loomed over him like a coming storm. He hadn't asked for this. He'd spent 7 years building a life so simple that nothing could touch him, nothing could hurt him. Wake up, survive the day, go to sleep, repeat. No complications, no connections, no reasons to hope or fear or feel anything at all. The gold changed everything. On the 4th day, Marcus forced himself to sit down at his small wooden table with a pencil and paper. He needed to think this through like an engineer, like the man he used to be. Break the problem into components. Analyze each piece. Find the logical solution. He started making lists. Option 1. Tell no one. Seal the cave permanently. Let the gold stay buried. Option 2. Report it to authorities. Let the government handle it. Option 3. Try to extract some or all of it himself. Option 4. Find someone trustworthy to help him decide. Each option had problems. Each option had risks. And underneath every scenario he sketched out, there was a deeper question that kept surfacing, one he'd been avoiding since the moment he'd touched that first gold bar. What did he deserve? Marcus set down his pencil and closed his eyes. The question opened a door he'd kept locked for 7 years. Behind it were memories he'd trained himself not to touch, moments he'd learned to bury under routine and exhaustion, and the sheer physical effort of mountain survival. But now they came flooding back. He was in his Denver office, 19 floors up with a view of the Front Range. It was late October, 7 years ago, and the aspens were turning gold on the mountainsides. His phone had rung at 6:47 in the evening. He remembered the exact time because he'd glanced at his watch, irritated at being interrupted while he reviewed safety protocols for a new extraction site. The voice on the other end had been calm, professional, a state patrol officer. There had been an accident on I-25. His wife and daughter had been involved. He needed to come to Denver General immediately. Marcus remembered driving too fast through rush-hour traffic. He remembered the fluorescent lights of the hospital corridor. He remembered the doctor's face, young, tired, sympathetic. He remembered the words, "I'm sorry. We did everything we could." He remembered Emily's hand, still warm when he held it. He remembered Sophie's gap-toothed smile frozen in the school picture they'd given him to identify her body. because her face had been too damaged to recognize. 7 years old. She'd been 7 years old. Marcus stood abruptly from the table, breathing hard. His chest felt tight. The cabin walls suddenly seemed too close, the air too thin. He pushed open the door and stepped outside into the cool mountain morning. The guilt was what had driven him here. Not just grief, though the grief had been crushing, apocalyptic in its weight, but guilt. Because Marcus had been the one who was supposed to pick them up from that birthday party. He'd been the one who'd promised Emily he'd leave work early for once. That he'd be the dad who showed up, who wasn't always buried in spreadsheets and safety reports and the next big project. But there had been a problem at the extraction site. Nothing major, just a variance in the drilling patterns that needed his review. It would take an hour, maybe 2. So he'd called Emily and asked if she minded getting Sophie. Just this once, just tonight. And she'd said, yes, because that's who Emily was. Understanding, patient, always accommodating his work, his career, his ambitions. That yes had killed them both. The drunk driver, a 23-year-old kid with 2 prior DUIs, had crossed the median at 8:17 p.m. He'd walked away with a broken arm. The jury had given him 12 years. He'd be out in 8 with good behavior. 8 years for 2 lives. Marcus had attended the sentencing. He'd sat in the courtroom and listened to the prosecutor detail the kid's history, the warnings he'd ignored, the choices he'd made. And the whole time Marcus had thought, but I made choices too. I chose work over family. I chose 1 more hour at the office over picking up my daughter. I chose wrong, and they paid the price. That guilt had followed him through the funeral, through the empty house, through the sleepless nights when he'd walk into Sophie's room and see her stuffed animals arranged on her bed exactly as she'd left them. It had followed him through the concerned calls from colleagues, through the well-meaning visits from friends who didn't understand that he didn't want their comfort. He'd wanted to disappear. And eventually, he had. Marcus walked to the edge of the clearing where his cabin sat. The morning sun was climbing over the eastern peaks, painting the valley in shades of amber and rose. 7 years ago, he'd come here to die slowly, to fade away from a world that had taken everything that mattered. And now that world had thrown $312 million at his feet and asked him to decide what kind of man he wanted to be. The irony wasn't lost on him. He spent the rest of the morning splitting firewood, losing himself in the physical rhythm. Swing the maul, feel it bite into the log, hear the crack of wood fiber giving way. Stack the pieces. Repeat. The work quieted his mind, or at least exhausted it enough that the thoughts came slower. By afternoon, he'd made a decision. He couldn't handle this alone. He needed perspective, advice, maybe just another human voice to confirm he wasn't losing his mind. And that meant he had to do something he hadn't done in 7 years. He had to go into town. Marcus cleaned himself up as best he could. He trimmed his beard with scissors, though it still hung halfway down his chest. He washed his hair in cold creek water. He put on his least worn clothes, jeans that weren't patched, a flannel shirt that wasn't threadbare, boots he'd saved for the rare occasions he had to hike to civilization. The walk to Pine Ridge took most of the afternoon. 15 miles of rough trail, then another 2 miles on the gravel road that eventually connected to the highway. Marcus moved steadily, his body remembering the route, even though his last trip had been years ago. As he walked, he rehearsed what he might say. How do you tell someone you've found a fortune in gold without sounding insane? How do you ask for help without putting them in danger? Because that was the other realization that had settled over him in the past few days. This gold was dangerous. People had died for it once, back in 1876, and people would die for it again if word got out. The sun was dropping toward the western peaks when Marcus finally reached Pine Ridge. The town looked even more desolate than he remembered. Main Street ran for maybe 6 blocks, half the buildings boarded up or collapsed. A gas station with 2 pumps, a combination post office, and general store, a diner with a faded sign that read, Betty's Place. A few houses scattered on the side streets, many of them vacant, windows dark. Maybe 150 people lived here now, maybe less. Marcus walked slowly up Main Street, suddenly aware of how he must look. Wild-eyed mountain man with a beard like a prophet. People would cross the street to avoid him, and he wouldn't blame them. The diner seemed like the safest option. Public place, food, coffee, maybe someone he could talk to, without immediately raising alarms. He pushed open the door. A bell chimed. Inside, the place was nearly empty. Worn vinyl booths, a long counter with stools, the smell of coffee and fried food, country music playing low from a radio behind the counter. A woman looked up from where she was wiping down tables. She was maybe 35, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, tired eyes that had seen too much. She wore jeans and a t-shirt with a name tag that read, Sarah. Kitchen closes in 20 minutes, she said, her voice neutral, professional. Then she really looked at him. Her eyes widened slightly. But take your time, have a seat. Marcus chose a booth near the back. Sarah brought him a menu and a glass of water without being asked. Coffee? She offered. Please. She returned with a mug and a pot, filling it to the brim. Marcus wrapped his hands around the warmth. Suddenly aware of how long it had been since he'd tasted coffee he hadn't made himself. You know what you want? Sarah asked. Burger. Fries. Whatever's easy. She scribbled on her pad and turned toward the kitchen, then paused. You're the guy who lives up in the mountains, aren't you? The hermit everyone talks about? Marcus looked up, surprised. People talk about me? Sarah shrugged. Small town. Not much else to talk about. Besides, I've seen you once before. Must have been 5, 6 years back. You came in for supplies at Mel's store. I don't remember. You wouldn't. You didn't look at anyone. Just bought what you needed and left. She studied him with those tired eyes. You look different now. Less angry, maybe. Or more scared. Hard to tell. Marcus didn't know what to say to that. Sarah didn't seem to expect an answer. She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving him alone with his coffee and his thoughts. The food came quickly. The burger was simple but good. The fries were hot and salty. Marcus ate slowly, savoring flavors he'd almost forgotten. As he ate, he watched Sarah move around the diner. She refilled coffee for the only other customers, 2 old men arguing about football. She wiped down the counter. She counted money from the register with practiced efficiency. There was something about her, a quietness, a competence. She reminded him, painfully, of Emily. Not in looks, but in bearing. The way she moved through her work with grace, despite obvious exhaustion. When she brought his check, Marcus made a decision. Can I ask you something? Sarah raised an eyebrow. Depends on what you're asking. This town, Pine Ridge, how's it doing? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. You have eyes. You walked through it. How do you think it's doing? That bad. Worse every year. The mine closed in 2005. The logging stopped in 2009. Now people leave, as fast as they can scrape together gas money. Another 5 years, there won't be anyone left but ghosts. She paused. Why do you care? You live up in the mountains, away from all this. Marcus hesitated. Maybe I'm tired of being away from everything. Sarah studied him for a long moment. Then she pulled out the chair across from him and sat down. That's the most interesting thing anyone said to me in months. Tell me more. But before Marcus could respond, the bell over the door chimed. A man walked in, tall, maybe 40, with the hard look of someone who'd spent time in prison or wished he had. He wore a leather jacket despite the warm evening, and his eyes were cold as they swept the diner. Those eyes landed on Marcus and stopped. Well, the man said, walking over. The mountain man himself. Haven't seen you in town in forever. What brings you down from your cave? Marcus's instincts, honed by 7 years of survival, immediately screamed danger. Just passing through. Passing through to where? There's nothing up that mountain but rocks and trees. The man pulled out a chair and sat down, uninvited. Name's Jake. Jake Morrison. I do a little prospecting. A little this and that. You probably know my uncle, Red Callahan. He's got a claim about 10 miles from where you're squatting. Don't know him? Sure you don't. Jake leaned back, studying Marcus like he was an interesting specimen. Funny thing, Uncle Red was up checking his claim yesterday. Said there was a landslide after that big storm. Said the whole north face of Eagle Ridge came down. That's near your place, isn't it? Marcus kept his face neutral. Lots of landslides after storms. Mountains do that. Sure. But Uncle Red, he's got a good eye for rock. Been prospecting these mountains for 40 years. And he said something about that slide looked funny. Like maybe it exposed something that was hidden before. Jake smiled, showing teeth. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you? Sarah stood up. Jake, you're making my customer uncomfortable. Either order something or get out. Easy, Sarah. Just making conversation with my new friend here. But Jake stood. You know, mountain man, if you found something interesting up there, you might want to think about sharing. These mountains can be dangerous for a man alone. Accidents happen. He walked out, the bell chiming behind him. Marcus's heart was pounding. Sarah sat back down, concern clear on her face. Jake Morrison is bad news, she said quietly. He runs with a rough crowd. Drug dealers mostly. But they'll steal anything that isn't nailed down. If he thinks you found something valuable. She trailed off. I should go, Marcus said, standing. Sarah grabbed his wrist. Her grip was firm. Wait, did you find something up there? Is that why you're in town? Marcus looked at her. Really looked at her. And he saw something in her eyes that made him trust her. Maybe it was desperation recognizing desperation. Maybe it was loneliness recognizing loneliness. Or maybe, after 7 years of solitude, he was simply starving for human connection and grasping at the first hand, extended. I need to talk to someone, he said quietly. Someone I can trust, but I don't know anyone here. Talk to me, Sarah said. You don't know me. No, but I know Jake Morrison, and if you're on his radar, you're in trouble. Maybe I can help. Marcus sat back down. For a long moment, they just looked at each other. Then Sarah called to the kitchen. Betty, I'm taking my break. She locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. She poured them both fresh coffee and sat down across from Marcus. All right, mountain man, start talking. And Marcus, against every instinct, against all the walls he'd built over 7 years, against the voice in his head screaming that this was a mistake, started telling her about the cave. He didn't tell her everything, not at first, just that he'd found something in the landslide, something valuable, something that could change lives if handled correctly, or destroy lives if handled wrong. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. How valuable? She finally asked. Marcus took a breath. Enough to save this town. Enough to save a lot of towns. Sarah's eyes widened. Jesus, what are you going to do? I don't know. That's why I'm here. I need advice. He trailed off, not sure how to finish. You need help, Sarah said. You can't do this alone. I barely know you. Yeah, well, I barely know you either. But I know what it's like to need help and have nowhere to turn. She glanced toward the kitchen. I've been working in this diner for 8 years. Raised my daughter here after her father left. Watched this town die piece by piece. Watched people lose their homes, their hope, their reasons to stay. So, if you're telling me there's something that could change that, I'm listening. Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. For 7 years, he'd carried everything alone. The grief, the guilt, the simple weight of survival. He'd told himself that was safer. That isolation was the only way to avoid being hurt again. But sitting across from Sarah in an empty diner, her tired eyes reflecting the same pain he carried. He realized that isolation wasn't safety. It was just another kind of death. "If I show you what I found," he said slowly, "your life will change. Maybe in good ways, but definitely in dangerous ways." Jake Morrison won't be the only one interested. There will be others, people who'll do anything for what's up there. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Sarah met his eyes. "My life is already dangerous. I'm a single mother in a dying town with $300 in savings and no future. If you're offering a chance at something better, I'll take the risk." "You have a daughter?" "Mia. She's 12. Smart as hell. Wants to be a doctor. But I can barely afford to keep her in school supplies." Sarah's voice caught. "Every day I watch her dream get smaller because she's figuring out that dreams cost money and we don't have any." Marcus thought about Sophie. 7 years old with dreams about being a veterinarian because she loved animals. She'd never gotten the chance to watch those dreams get smaller. She'd just been stolen from the world before she could grow into them. "How old?" Sarah asked, reading something in his face. "What?" "The person you lost. I can see it all over you. Someone died. Someone you loved." Marcus's throat tightened. "My wife and daughter. 7 years ago. Car accident. I'm sorry. Everyone's sorry. It doesn't help." "No," Sarah agreed. "It doesn't. But maybe doing something good with what you found does. Maybe that's why you found it." Marcus wanted to argue that the universe didn't work that way, that there was no cosmic justice or divine plan, that good people died and bad people prospered, and sometimes a mountain just collapsed and exposed a cave, and it didn't mean anything. But he couldn't make himself say it, because sitting here with Sarah, talking about possibilities instead of hiding from them, he felt something he'd thought was dead. Not hope exactly, not yet, but maybe the soil where hope could grow. "There's someone I should talk to," Sarah said. "A lawyer. Her name is Patricia Marsh. She moved here 2 years ago from Denver, trying to slow down, get away from the corporate world. She's good, honest. If anyone can help us figure out the legal side of this, it's her. Can she be trusted? I trust her with my life. She's helped half the people in this town with pro bono work. Kept my friend from losing her house. Got another friend out of an abusive marriage." Sarah stood. "Come on. I know where she lives. Let's go talk to her. Now. It's almost dark. You think Jake Morrison is waiting until morning to figure out what you found? We need to move fast." Marcus hesitated. This was happening too quickly. He'd come into town just to get coffee and maybe some perspective. Now he was partnering with a woman he'd met an hour ago to visit a lawyer he'd never heard of about a fortune that could get them all killed. But Sarah was right about one thing. Jake Morrison wasn't going to wait. And if Marcus went back to the mountains alone, he'd be a target, with no witnesses and no help. "All right," he said. "Let's go." They walked through the darkening streets of Pine Ridge. The town looked even more desolate at dusk, shadows filling the empty storefronts, streetlights flickering over cracked pavement. Sarah led him to a small house on the edge of town, lights glowing warm in the windows. She knocked. After a moment, a woman answered. She was maybe 50, grey hair cut short, glasses, wearing jeans and a cardigan. She looked like someone's kind aunt. "Sarah? What's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong." "Well, actually, everything's complicated. Can we come in? This is Marcus. He needs legal advice." Patricia looked at Marcus, taking in his wild appearance, and didn't flinch. "Come in. I'll make tea." Inside, the house was cozy, lined with bookshelves. Patricia made tea while Sarah and Marcus sat at her kitchen table. When she joined them, Sarah looked at Marcus. "Tell her." So Marcus told the story again, This time he included more details: the exact location of the cave, the estimated value, the markings on the gold bars, the documents he'd found, the message carved in stone. Patricia listened carefully, asking questions, making notes. When he finished, she set down her pen. "This is the most complicated situation I've encountered in 30 years of practicing law," she said, "and potentially the most important. Do you understand what you're sitting on?" $312 million, Marcus said. "No, you're sitting on a historical discovery that could have archaeological significance, legal ramifications, involving mineral rights and salvage laws, and enough complications to keep courts busy for years." She paused. "But you're also sitting on something that could genuinely help people. The question is whether we can navigate the legal maze without losing everything to government seizure or getting you killed by treasure hunters." "So what do we do?" Sarah asked. Patricia thought for a moment. "We need a team, people we can trust, a historian to authenticate the find, a geologist to assess the site, legal representation that goes beyond my small-town practice, and security, because the moment word gets out, you're all in danger." "Word is already getting out," Marcus said. "Jake Morrison knows something's up. Then we move fast. Tomorrow, I'll make calls. We'll bring in people I trust, colleagues from my Denver days. We'll document everything properly, file the right claims, and try to do this legally." She looked at Marcus. "But you need to understand. Once we start this process, there's no going back. Your isolation is over. Your secret is gone. Are you ready for that?" Marcus thought about the 7 years in the mountains. He thought about Emily and Sophie. He thought about the message carved in the cave wall. It cost us everything. Maybe the real question wasn't whether he was ready. Maybe the question was whether he was brave enough. He looked at Sarah, who was risking her safety and her daughter's future on the word of a stranger. He looked at Patricia, who was willing to help despite the obvious dangers. For 7 years, Marcus had believed that caring about anything was too painful. That connection was just an invitation for the world to hurt you again. But sitting in Patricia's warm kitchen, drinking tea with 2 women who'd shown him more kindness in one evening than he'd experienced in 7 years, he realized something. Maybe the cost of treasure wasn't always loss. Maybe sometimes the cost was having to live again, having to care again, having to risk your heart after it had been shattered. Maybe that was the price worth paying. "I'm ready," Marcus said. "Let's do this right." Patricia's kitchen became a war room. Over the next 3 days, maps spread across the table, legal documents stacked in neat piles, coffee mugs multiplying like rabbits, and people, more people than Marcus had seen in one place in 7 years, coming and going with information, expertise, and quiet determination. The first to arrive was Tom Chen, a geologist Patricia had worked with on environmental cases back in Denver. He was in his 60s, with wire-rimmed glasses and hands that never stopped moving. He examined Marcus's photographs of the cave with the intensity of a surgeon studying X-rays. "This is legitimate," Tom said, tapping one of the photos, showing the stamp on a gold bar. The Consolidated Mining Company was real. They operated several claims in this region from 1872 to 1877. Then they vanished from all records. Nobody knew what happened to them. "Until now," Patricia said. Tom nodded. "The question is, who owns it? Under Colorado law, mineral rights are complicated. The original mining claim would have expired long ago. The land could be federal, state, or private. And then there's the question of archaeological significance versus salvage rights." "In English?" Sarah asked. "It means this could belong to the government, to Marcus, to whoever owns the surface rights, or to nobody until a judge decides. And every option means years of litigation." Tom looked at Marcus. "Unless we can establish a compelling reason why the gold should be released quickly." "Like what?" Marcus asked. "Like proving it can serve the public good. Emergency relief. Community restoration. Something that makes keeping it locked in legal limbo look cruel. Marcus thought about Pine Ridge's empty storefronts and Sarah's daughter dreaming smaller dreams. This town is dying. Would that count? Tom and Patricia exchanged glances. It might, Patricia said, if we can document the need and present a comprehensive plan for how the gold would be used. That's when Sarah had her idea. What if we don't tell everyone about the gold? Not yet. What if we just tell them we found something valuable and we need their help to save the town? Get people invested in the solution before they know the details. You want to organize the community without telling them what they're organizing for. Patricia looked skeptical. I want to give them hope before the lawyers and the government and the treasure hunters show up and take it all away. Because once word gets out about 300 million in gold, this town will be overrun. But if we have a plan in place first, if we have people committed to protecting what's ours, maybe we stand a chance. Marcus watched Sarah as she spoke. Her exhaustion had lifted over the past 3 days, replaced by something fiercer. Purpose. The same transformation he felt, happening inside himself. She's right, Marcus said. We need people on our side before this explodes. Patricia thought for a long moment. All right, but we need to be careful about who we tell and when. Jake Morrison is already suspicious. If he gets confirmation, he'll either try to steal the gold himself or sell the information to people who will. Then we move tonight, Sarah said. There's a town meeting scheduled for 7 o'clock. Budget discussion. Usually, about 10 people show up. Because nobody cares about budgets when there's no money to budget. But tonight, we'll make them care. The Pine Ridge Community Center was a converted church that hadn't seen a congregation in 20 years. Folding chairs arranged in crooked rows. A podium at the front. Fluorescent lights that buzzed and flickered. When Marcus walked in with Sarah and Patricia, he counted 12 people scattered across the chairs. All of them over 50. All of them wearing the same expression. Tired, resignation. Mayor Bill Tucker stood at the podium, droning through a financial report that basically said the town was broke and getting broker. He was 72, had been mayor for 18 years, and looked like he'd given up hope around year 3. Any questions? He asked, clearly expecting none. Sarah stood. I have something to say. Mayor Tucker blinked. Sarah, this is about the budget. No, this is about the future. Or whether we have one. She walked to the front, her voice steady despite her nervousness. I know. Everyone here has thought about leaving. Selling their house for whatever they can get. Moving to a city. Starting over. I've thought about it too. Every time Mia asks why her school doesn't have a music program anymore. Every time I see another family pack up and leave. Heads nodded. People shifted in their seats. But what if we didn't have to leave? What if there was a way to save Pine Ridge? To bring it back to what it was, maybe even make it better? An old woman in the front row, Gladys Henderson, who'd run the general store for 40 years, spoke up. With what money, honey? We can't even afford to fix the potholes. What if money wasn't the problem anymore? The room went quiet. Mayor Tucker frowned. Sarah, what are you talking about? Sarah looked at Marcus. He stood, feeling every eye in the room turn to him. A dozen faces studying the wild mountain man who'd appeared out of nowhere. My name is Marcus Hayes, he said. Some of you might have heard about the hermit living up in the mountains. That's me. And 3 days ago, I found something. Something that could change everything for this town. What kind of something? A man in the back asked. The kind that's valuable enough to rebuild Pine Ridge from the ground up. But it's complicated. And it's dangerous. And if we're going to do this right, I need your help. The questions came fast. What did you find? Where is it? How much is it worth? Can we see it? Patricia stepped forward, her lawyer voice cutting through the chaos. We can't share all the details yet, for legal reasons and for everyone's safety. But what we can tell you is this. Marcus has discovered something of significant historical and monetary value. We're in the process of securing it legally. And if we succeed, the plan is to use the resources to revitalize Pine Ridge. Why? Gladys asked. Why would you share it with us? You could take whatever you found and leave. Buy yourself a mansion in Denver. Marcus met her eyes. Because I've spent 7 years running from the world, and I'm tired of running. Because this town deserves a second chance. And maybe I do too. The room was silent for a long moment. Then a man stood up. Frank Delgado, owner of the closed-down hardware store. He was 58, weathered, with hands scarred from decades of honest work. I don't know what you found, Frank said, but I know what we've lost. My store, my livelihood. My kids had to move to Colorado Springs because there's no work here. If you're saying there's a chance to bring them home, to give this town a future, then I'm in. Tell me what you need. One by one, others stood. Betty from the diner, Gladys from the general store, Tom Richardson, who'd been the volunteer fire chief for 20 years, Margaret Klein, the retired teacher who still tutored kids for free in her living room. Not everyone. A few people left, shaking their heads, clearly thinking this was either a scam or a fantasy. But 8 stayed. 8 people who'd lived through Pine Ridge's slow death and were willing to risk believing in resurrection. Sarah stepped forward again. Here's what we need. First, absolute secrecy. You can't tell anyone what we've discussed here. Not your spouse. Not your best friend. Not until we say it's safe. Second, we need people to help with logistics, transportation, security, documentation. Third, we need you to trust us, to believe that we're trying to do this the right way, even when it gets hard. And it will get hard, Patricia added. There are people who'll try to steal what Marcus found. There are legal battles ahead. There will be pressure from authorities, from treasure hunters, from everyone who thinks they have a claim. We need to stand together. Mayor Tucker finally spoke up. This is crazy. You're talking about organizing a town conspiracy based on some vague promise of treasure. Not treasure, Marcus said. Hope. When's the last time anyone offered this town that? The mayor had no answer. They spent the next 2 hours organizing. Frank Delgado would coordinate security. He had hunting rifles and knew which men in town could be trusted with weapons. Betty would handle communications, making sure everyone stayed informed without word leaking out. Tom Richardson would use his fire department connections to arrange for secure transportation when the time came. Margaret Klein would research the town's history, looking for any records that might help establish local claims to the discovery. As the meeting broke up, people approached Marcus one by one. They shook his hand. They thanked him. They looked at him with something he hadn't seen directed at himself in 7 years. Respect. Sarah found him outside afterward, standing in the parking lot and staring up at the stars. You did good in there, she said. I barely said anything. You gave them hope. That's more than anyone's given this town in years. She paused. How does it feel? Being around people again? Marcus considered the question. Terrifying, and kind of good. Is that strange? No. I think that's called being human. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Sarah's phone buzzed. She checked it, and her face went pale. What's wrong? Marcus asked. Text from Betty. Someone was asking questions at the diner tonight. About you. About what brought you into town. About whether you'd found anything interesting up in the mountains. Jake Morrison. Worse. Betty says it was 2 men she'd never seen before. Professional types. They paid in cash and drove a black SUV with Denver plates. Marcus's stomach dropped. How did they know to come here? I don't know. But they're looking for you. And if they're willing to drive all the way out here to ask questions, they're serious. Patricia walked up, catching the end of the conversation. We need to move faster. If people from outside are already interested, we're running out of time. Tom Chen can do a preliminary site assessment tomorrow. I've got a contact at the State Archaeological Office who owes me a favor, and I know a federal judge in Denver who specializes in mineral rights cases. That's a lot of people, Marcus said uneasily. It's the minimum we need to have any chance of keeping the gold legal and keeping you alive. Patricia's face was grim. Marcus, you need to understand something. The moment we file official paperwork, this becomes public record. Every treasure hunter, every con artist, every desperate person in the country will know about it. Your life as you knew it is over. It was already over, Marcus said. It ended 7 years ago. Then let's make sure what comes next is worth it. The next morning, Marcus led Tom Chen and Frank Delgado up to the cave. It was the first time he'd returned since the initial discovery, and he was shocked by what he found. The entrance had been disturbed. The rocks he'd carefully arranged to hide it had been moved, then replaced in a slightly different pattern. Someone had been here. Frank saw it too. His hand went to the rifle slung over his shoulder. We're not alone up here. They approached carefully. The entrance was still sealed, but there were boot prints in the soft earth nearby. Fresh ones, maybe a day old. Could be hikers, Tom said, though he didn't sound convinced. Hikers don't reorganize rock piles, Marcus said. Someone was looking for something. They squeezed through the entrance, into the shaft. Marcus's flashlight beam swept the tunnel. Everything looked the same until they reached the main chamber. One of the gold bars was missing. Marcus counted and recounted, his heart pounding. 1,223 bars. There had been 1,224. They took a sample, Tom said quietly. Someone got in here, took one bar to authenticate it, and left everything else. That means they're planning to come back. With more people, Frank added. Probably armed. They spent an hour documenting everything, taking detailed photographs and measurements. Tom collected samples of the rock and examined the stamps on multiple gold bars. He handled them with reverence, understanding the historical significance. This is real, he kept saying. This is actually real. On the hike back down, Marcus couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every rustling branch made him flinch. Every shadow seemed to hide danger. They were right to be paranoid. That night, as Marcus walked from Patricia's house back toward the edge of town, where he'd been staying in Betty's garage apartment, a truck pulled up beside him. The window rolled down, revealing Jake Morrison's cold smile. Mountain Man, we need to talk. I don't think we do. 2 more men got out of the truck. Big guys with the look of men who broke things for money. Marcus's survival instincts screamed at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. Main Street was empty. Streetlights were few and far between. Jake got out of the truck slowly. Here's the thing. I know you found something up there. My associates here, they're very interested in what it might be. So, we're going to take a little drive up into the mountains, and you're going to show us exactly where that cave is. I don't know what you're talking about. One of the big men grabbed Marcus's arm. Pain shot through his shoulder as the grip tightened. Wrong answer, Jake said. Try again. Then a voice cut through the darkness. Let him go. They all turned. Sarah stood there, holding a baseball bat. Behind her, Frank Delgado, with his hunting rifle. Behind him, Tom Richardson with a tire iron. Behind him, 4 more people from the town meeting, all armed with various improvised weapons. Jake laughed, but it sounded forced. What is this, the town militia? Something like that, Frank said, raising the rifle. Now, my hand's a little shaky these days. Arthritis. I'd hate for this gun to accidentally go off. The big men released Marcus and backed toward the truck. Jake's face was red with anger. You people don't know what you're messing with. That gold doesn't belong to you. Doesn't belong to you either, Sarah said. Now leave, and if we see you around here again, we won't be so friendly. Jake got in the truck. Before he drove away, he leaned out the window. This isn't over. You just made powerful enemies. The truck roared off, tail lights disappearing into the darkness. Marcus was shaking, adrenaline flooding his system. Sarah lowered the bat and turned to him. You okay? How did you know? Betty saw Jake's truck cruising Main Street. She called me. I called everyone else. Sarah smiled grimly. Welcome to small town protection. We take care of our own. Over the next week, things moved with frightening speed. Patricia filed preliminary paperwork with the state, establishing Marcus's claim as the discoverer of a historical site. Tom Chen's report confirmed the gold's authenticity and estimated the total value at $312 million. The number hit the local news first, then the regional stations, then, inevitably, the national media. Mountain Man discovers $300 million in gold, ran the headlines. Marcus's face was plastered across every screen. His privacy, his isolation, his carefully constructed exile, all of it evaporated in 48 hours of news cycle frenzy. The town was inundated. Reporters camped out on Main Street. Treasure hunters rolled in with metal detectors and wild dreams. Lawyers showed up, offering to represent Marcus for a percentage. Federal agents arrived with briefcases and stern expressions. And through it all, the people of Pine Ridge formed a wall. They wouldn't talk to reporters. They gave treasure hunters directions that led in circles. They politely told lawyers the town had representation. They cooperated with federal agents but gave away nothing that wasn't required. Marcus watched it happen with amazement. These people who'd been strangers a week ago were now defending him like family. Sarah organized rotating shifts to make sure he was never alone. Frank set up a security perimeter around the cave site. Betty turned the diner into unofficial headquarters, feeding everyone involved and refusing payment. This is what communities do, Margaret Klein told him one evening. We protect each other. You gave us something to protect and something to fight for. That's more than we've had in years. The legal battle was fierce. The federal government filed a claim, arguing the gold was found on public land and belonged to the Treasury. The state of Colorado filed a counterclaim, citing mineral rights laws. A descendant of one of the original Consolidated Mining Company owners emerged, claiming inheritance rights. But Patricia was brilliant. She'd assembled a legal team that included specialists in mineral law, historical preservation, and civil rights. They argued that the gold represented not just monetary value, but historical significance to the region. They presented a comprehensive plan for how the resources would be used: hospital construction, school funding, infrastructure repair, business grants, historical preservation. And they introduced witness after witness from Pine Ridge, testifying about the town's decline and the desperate need for economic revitalization. The judge, a woman named Sandra Morrison, with 30 years on the bench, listened carefully to all sides. Then she did something unexpected. She ordered mediation. This case could take 5 years to litigate, she said. Meanwhile, the gold sits in a cave, doing nobody any good, and a town continues to die. I'm appointing a special mediator to work with all parties to find a solution that serves justice, history, and the public good. The mediator was a retired ambassador named Robert Chen, Tom's brother, who'd spent 40 years negotiating international disputes. He was patient, brilliant, and utterly unimpressed by posturing from any side. Over 6 weeks of intense negotiation, a deal emerged. The federal government would receive 30% of the value for the Treasury. The state of Colorado would receive 20% for public works. The descendant of the mining company would receive 10% as compensation, and 40%, $125 million, would be placed in a trust administered by a board that included Marcus, Patricia, Sarah, and 3 appointed state officials. The trust would be dedicated to the revitalization of Pine Ridge and similar struggling rural communities across Colorado. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't what Marcus had imagined when he first touched that gold bar, in the darkness. But it was real, legal, and immediate. When the judge signed the final order, Sarah hugged Marcus so hard he couldn't breathe. Patricia had tears running down her face. Even Frank Delgado, the gruff hardware store owner, wiped his eyes. "We did it," Sarah whispered. "We actually did it." The first thing they built was a medical clinic. Dr. Reina Ortega, who'd been commuting from 2 towns over to provide basic care, finally had a proper facility with modern equipment. Mia, Sarah's daughter, volunteered there every weekend, shadowing Dr. Ortega and learning what it meant to heal. Then came the school renovations. New roof, new computers, new textbooks, and yes, a music program. Margaret Klein returned to teaching. Her classroom finally equipped with supplies that weren't bought from her own retirement savings. Frank Delgado reopened his hardware store, stocked with inventory, paid for by a small business grant from the trust. Within months, 4 other businesses opened on Main Street. The post office got new sorting equipment, the fire department got a new truck, and people started coming back. Young families who'd left for the cities heard about the transformation and returned. New residents discovered Pine Ridge and saw opportunity instead of decay. The population, which had dropped to 147, began climbing. 160, 180, 200. Pine Ridge was breathing again. Marcus barely recognized himself in the mirror. He'd trimmed his beard to something reasonable. He'd bought new clothes. He'd moved from Betty's garage into a small house on the edge of town, not isolated, but not suffocated either. And he was learning, slowly, to be around people again. He still took long walks in the mountains. He still needed silence and solitude to process everything. But he also had coffee with Sarah most mornings. He helped Frank at the hardware store on Saturdays. He read to kids at Margaret's literacy program on Tuesday evenings. He was building a life, not the one he'd lost, that was gone forever. And no amount of gold could bring Emily and Sophie back, but a new life. One where he honored their memory by living, by connecting, by believing that good things could still happen in a broken world. One evening, 8 months after the discovery, Marcus stood outside the cave entrance with Sarah. They'd turned the site into a historical landmark, with tours run by Margaret Klein and a museum being planned for the town center. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked. "Finding the gold? Everything that came after?" Marcus thought about it. About the danger and the stress and the loss of his isolation. About Jake Morrison, who'd been arrested trying to sneak into the cave with 3 armed men. About the media circus and the legal battles and the constant demands on his time. Then he thought about Mia's face when Sarah told her they could afford college. About Frank's son moving back to reopen the hardware store. About the clinic saving Mrs. Henderson's life when she had a heart attack. About the children's laughter echoing through a renovated school. "No," he said, "I don't regret it. It cost me everything I was hiding behind, but it gave me everything I'd forgotten was possible." Sarah smiled and leaned her head on his shoulder. They stood there in the fading light, watching the sun set over the valley, over the town that had been dying and now was learning to live again. And Marcus Hayes, the hermit who'd fled the world 7 years ago, realized he'd finally found his way home. The night Jake Morrison came back with serious men was 3 months after the mediation agreement had been signed. Marcus was asleep in his small house when his phone rang at 2:17 in the morning. It was Frank Delgado, voice tight with urgency. They're heading up the mountain. 4 vehicles. Maybe 12 men. All armed. Marcus was out of bed instantly, pulling on clothes. "How do you know?" Tom Richardson was doing security rotation. Saw them pass the checkpoint. "We set up on the access road." He called it in, then followed at a distance. "Marcus, these aren't local thugs. These are professionals. Call Patricia. Call the sheriff. I'm heading up there. You shouldn't go alone. I'm not letting them destroy that site. It's not about the gold anymore. It's history. Marcus grabbed his gear and headed into the darkness. The mountain trail was treacherous at night, but he'd walked it so many times he could navigate by feel. His heart pounded not from exertion but from anger. They'd worked so hard to do this right, to follow the law, to make sure the gold served a purpose beyond greed. And now men with guns were trying to take it all. He reached the cave site 40 minutes later. 4 SUVs were parked haphazardly on the access road they'd cut for the archaeological team. Flashlight beams danced in the darkness around the cave entrance. Voices carried on the night air, harsh and commanding. Marcus crept closer, staying in the shadows. He counted 10 men, maybe 11. They had professional mining equipment, drills, hauling gear, even a portable winch. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was an organized extraction operation. Jake Morrison stood near the cave entrance, directing the operation. And beside him, wearing an expensive jacket that looked out of place in the wilderness, was a man Marcus didn't recognize. 50s. Gray hair. The bearing of someone used to being obeyed. "Move faster," the man said. His voice carried authority and impatience. "We have maybe 2 hours before authorities respond. I want 50 bars minimum. 100 if possible." Marcus's blood ran cold. Even 50 bars at current market value would be over $22 million. Enough to disappear, to buy new identities, to vanish into a country without extradition treaties. He pulled out his phone to call for help and realized he had no signal. The mountains blocked it. He was on his own. No, he'd spent 7 years being on his own. He wasn't that person anymore. Marcus worked his way back down the trail until his phone showed 1 bar of signal. He called Frank. "They're extracting gold right now. At least 50 bars. Maybe more. Where's the cavalry?" "Sheriff's department is 20 minutes out. Federal agents are coming from Denver. Maybe an hour. State police are en route." "But Marcus," they all said the same thing. "Stay away. Let them handle it. These men are dangerous. The site will be stripped clean in 20 minutes. Then let it be stripped. Better that than you being shot." Marcus ended the call. He stood there, in the darkness, listening to the sound of drilling echoing down the mountain. Every instinct told him to wait for law enforcement, to stay safe, to let the professionals handle it. But he thought about Margaret Klein's face when she talked about the new school, about Mia studying medicine, because the clinic made her believe in possibilities, about the families moving back to Pine Ridge because hope had returned. That gold wasn't just money anymore. It was dreams made real, and he wasn't going to let criminals steal it without a fight. Marcus circled around the site, approaching from above. The cave entrance was carved into a cliff face, with a steep slope rising behind it. If he could get to higher ground, maybe he could at least slow them down, buy time for help to arrive. He climbed carefully, using roots and rocks for handholds. His breath came hard in the thin mountain air. Below, the men worked with mechanical efficiency, hauling gold bars out of the cave and loading them into cases. Marcus reached a position directly above the cave entrance. Large rocks lined the cliff edge, held in place by nothing but gravity and time. He examined them in the faint moonlight. Some were stable, others were loose, ready to fall with the right pressure. He'd spent years as a mining engineer. He understood rock stability, stress points, calculated risks, and he understood that what he was considering was incredibly dangerous and possibly insane. But watching those men loot a site that had taken months to secure legally, that represented hope for an entire community, made the choice clear. Marcus braced his back against a large boulder and pushed with his legs. The stone didn't move at first. He adjusted position, found better leverage, and pushed harder. The rock shifted an inch, then another. Then it toppled over the edge. The boulder crashed down the cliff face, slamming into other rocks and triggering a cascade. It wasn't a full landslide, but it was enough. Stones rained down near the cave entrance, forcing the men to scatter, shouting in alarm. "What the hell?" someone yelled. "Is the cliff collapsing? Get back! Get away from the entrance!" Marcus didn't wait to see the results. He scrambled laterally across the slope, trying to put distance between himself and the site, before they figured out the rockfall wasn't natural. But his boot caught on a root. He stumbled, slid, and before he could catch himself, he was tumbling down the steep slope in a shower of loose dirt and stones. He crashed through brush, slammed into a tree trunk, and finally came to rest 30 feet below his starting point. Pain exploded in his left leg. When he tried to stand, his ankle buckled. Sprained or broken, he couldn't tell. Flashlight beams swept toward him. There, someone's up there. It's the mountain man, the one who found the gold. Boots pounded up the slope. Marcus tried to crawl away, but his injured leg made it impossible. Within seconds, hands grabbed him, hauling him upright. Pain lanced through his ankle, and he bit back a scream. They dragged him down to the cave entrance and threw him on the ground. Jake Morrison stood over him, face twisted with rage. "You stupid son of a bitch. You could have killed someone with that stunt." The gray-haired man in the expensive jacket approached, studying Marcus with cold calculation. "So, this is Marcus Hayes, the hermit who got lucky and thought he could keep it all for his little town project." "Who are you?" Marcus gasped through the pain. "Someone who understands that $300 million is too much money to leave in the hands of small-town amateurs." The man crouched down, bringing his face level with Marcus's. "Here's what's going to happen. We're going to take what we came for. You're going to stay quiet about it. Because if you don't, if you make this difficult, people you care about will have unfortunate accidents. That schoolteacher who runs the literacy program, the single mother who works at the diner, her daughter who wants to be a doctor. Accidents happen all the time in small towns." Marcus's vision tunneled with fury. "You threaten them, and you'll what? You're alone in the mountains with a broken leg and 12 men who'd be happy to throw you into a ravine. You have no leverage here." But then, another voice cut through the darkness. "Actually, he has all the leverage." Everyone turned. Sarah stood at the edge of the clearing, and she wasn't alone. Frank Delgado was beside her with his hunting rifle, Tom Richardson with a shotgun, Betty holding a pistol that looked older than she was, and behind them, spreading out in a semicircle, were at least 20 people from Pine Ridge. Some armed, some just holding flashlights and determination. "This is our mountain," Sarah said. "Our town, our future, and you're not taking it." The gray-haired man laughed, but it sounded hollow. "You think a bunch of townspeople with hunting rifles can stop us? We have automatic weapons in the vehicles." "Maybe," Frank said calmly, "but before you could reach them, we'd start shooting. And in the dark, in the confusion, a lot of people would die, including you. Is that worth it?" The man's expression hardened. "You're bluffing." "Try me," Frank said, and the absolute certainty in his voice made it clear he wasn't. For a long moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the wind through the pines and Marcus's ragged breathing. Then, sirens wailed in the distance. Multiple vehicles, coming fast up the mountain road. The gray-haired man's face went pale. He turned to his men. "Load what we have and move out. Now." "Sir, we've only got 20 bars." I said move. The men scrambled, abandoning their equipment and rushing to the SUVs. Engines roared to life. They peeled out, tires spinning on loose gravel, disappearing down the access road just as the first police vehicles appeared, lights flashing red and blue against the trees. Sarah ran to Marcus, dropping to her knees beside him. "Are you insane? You could have been killed." "Had to slow them down," Marcus said through gritted teeth. "Couldn't let them strip the site. You idiot. We'll get more gold. We can't get another you." The words hit Marcus harder than his fall down the cliff. For 7 years, he'd believed he was expendable, that his life had ended with Emily and Sophie. that nothing he did mattered. But looking at Sarah's tear-streaked face, at the townspeople who'd risked their own safety to protect him, he realized how wrong he'd been. He mattered, not because of what he'd found, but because of what he'd helped build. A community, a family, a future that included him. The sheriff's department and federal agents swarmed the site. They found the abandoned mining equipment, the 20 gold bars the criminals had managed to load, and tire tracks that would help identify the vehicles. The gray-haired man and his crew were arrested 3 hours later at a roadblock near the Wyoming border. His name was Vincent Carrera, and he turned out to be a disgraced financier with connections to organized crime. Jake Morrison, facing charges of conspiracy and armed robbery, quickly turned informant. Within a week, federal prosecutors had dismantled an entire network that had been targeting historical treasure sites across the western United States. Marcus spent 3 days in the hospital with a fractured ankle and various bruises. Sarah barely left his side. On the second day, Mia brought him flowers she'd picked and a card she'd made that read, "Thank you for saving our future." Marcus cried when he read it. Not sad tears, but the kind that come when something frozen inside finally thaws. Patricia visited on the third day with news. The federal judge was not happy about the attempted theft. She's fast-tracked our permits and agreed to provide additional security at the site until the extraction is complete. We're looking at full access to the trust funds within 60 days instead of 6 months. 60 days, Marcus repeated. That's real. That's actually happening. It's happening because you fought for it. Because this town fought for it. Patricia smiled. You built something good here, Marcus. Something worth protecting. The extraction process took 3 months. Archaeological teams carefully documented every gold bar, every artifact, every detail of the cave, before the gold was transported to secure facilities. Historians from the University of Colorado published papers about the Consolidated Mining Company and the lost gold of 1876. The cave itself was preserved as a historical site, with plans for a museum and educational center, and the money started flowing into Pine Ridge. The medical clinic expanded into a full hospital with an emergency room and surgical facilities. Dr. Ortega hired 3 more physicians and 5 nurses. When old Walter Price had a heart attack, he received treatment within minutes, instead of dying while waiting for an ambulance to arrive from 2 towns over. The school building was completely renovated. New roof, new heating system, new technology center, new gymnasium, new music and art programs. Margaret Klein hired 4 new teachers, reducing class sizes and giving kids individual attention they'd never had. Graduation rates, which had been at 58%, climbed to 91% within 2 years. Frank Delgado's hardware store became the anchor of a revitalized Main Street. A bookstore opened, a coffee shop, a boutique clothing store, a restaurant that served more than diner food. Young entrepreneurs moved to Pine Ridge, attracted by small business grants, from the trust and the promise of a community that supported local ownership. The population passed 300, then 400. New houses were built on the outskirts of town. The old community center was replaced with a modern facility that housed the library, a recreation center, and meeting spaces. But the most important changes weren't visible in buildings or balance sheets. They showed up in faces. Betty didn't look exhausted anymore. She'd hired help at the diner and took Sundays off for the first time in a decade. Frank's son moved back from Colorado Springs with his wife and 2 kids, reopening the family hardware business. Margaret Klein's former students started returning to teach at the renovated school, bringing their education and experience back to the community that had raised them. And Sarah bloomed. The stress lines around her eyes softened. She laughed more. She started taking classes at night, finally finishing the degree she'd abandoned when Mia was born. She had plans to open a community center focused on single-parent support and job training. Mia, shadowed Dr. Ortega every weekend at the hospital. She was 14 now, confident and brilliant, already taking advanced placement courses and talking about medical schools. Her dreams weren't getting smaller anymore. They were expanding to fill the future that had opened before her. Marcus watched it all unfold with quiet amazement. He'd gone from a man who wanted nothing to do with the world to someone who couldn't imagine being anywhere else. He bought a small house on Maple Street, 2 blocks from Sarah's place. He volunteered at the school, teaching basic engineering and geology to high schoolers. He led hiking tours of the cave site for visitors and history enthusiasts. He served on the trust board, helping decide how funds would be allocated. And slowly, carefully, he opened his heart again. It started with friendship. Coffee with Sarah most mornings. Dinner at her place once a week, where Mia would monopolize the conversation with excited talk about her studies. Movie nights at the renovated community center. Town events where people greeted him not as the hermit or the man who found the gold, but just as Marcus. One afternoon, 6 months after the hospital stay, Marcus found himself in an unexpected place. The playground, behind the new elementary school. Sarah had asked him to help install new equipment, and he'd agreed without thinking much about it. But as he tightened bolts on a swing set, watching children run and laugh around him, something inside him shifted. A little girl, maybe 7 years old with dark pigtails, approached him shyly. She held out a dandelion she'd picked from the grass. "Is this for you?" she asked. Marcus looked at the flower, then at her gap-toothed smile, and his chest tightened. Sophie had been 7. Sophie had loved picking flowers. "For me?" he managed to say. "Yeah. My mom says you're the man who saved our town. I wanted to say thank you." She pressed the dandelion into his hand and ran back to her friends. Marcus stood there, holding the fragile stem, tears streaming down his face. Sarah found him like that, standing in the middle of the playground, weeping. "Marcus? What's wrong?" He couldn't speak at first. He just held up the dandelion. Sarah understood immediately. She wrapped her arms around him and let him cry. Right there in front of the swings and slides and the children who represented everything he'd lost and everything he was learning to love again. "It's okay," she whispered. "It's okay to remember. It's okay to hurt. And it's okay to heal." That night, Marcus did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He took out the box of photographs he'd kept hidden in his closet. Photos of Emily and Sophie. Birthday parties. Christmas mornings. Ordinary days that had been extraordinary because they were together. He spread them across his kitchen table and really looked at them, not with the crushing guilt that had driven him into the mountains, but with something softer, gratitude, love, and the painful but necessary understanding that honoring their memory didn't mean stopping his own life. Sarah knocked on his door around 9. He'd called her, asking if she could come over. When she saw the photographs, she didn't ask questions. She just sat down beside him. "Tell me about them," she said. So Marcus did. He told her about Emily's terrible sense of direction, how she'd get lost in their own neighborhood, about Sophie's obsession with dinosaurs, how she'd memorized the names of 50 different species before she could spell her own name, about the Sunday morning pancake tradition and the way Emily sang in the shower, and Sophie's habit of leaving her shoes in the middle of the hallway where Marcus would trip over them. He laughed, telling these stories. Really laughed. And it didn't feel like a betrayal. It felt like breathing after being underwater too long. "They would have liked you," Marcus said quietly. "I wish I could have met them." "Me too." He looked at Sarah, at this woman who'd shown him it was possible to live again. "But I'm glad I met you. Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Sarah said, taking his hand. "It makes you human. Love isn't a finite resource, Marcus. Loving me and Mia doesn't mean you loved Emily and Sophie any less. Your heart is big enough for all of us." Those words unlocked something in Marcus that he'd kept chained for 7 years. Permission. Not to forget, not to replace, but to continue. To let the past be part of him without letting it be all of him. Then one evening, a year and a half after the discovery, Sarah invited him to dinner. Just the two of them. Mia was at a friend's house for the night. They ate pasta and drank wine and talked about everything and nothing. And when the conversation finally wound down, Sarah looked at him across the table with those tired but no longer exhausted eyes and said, "I'm glad you came down from that mountain." "Me too," Marcus said. "I mean it. Not just for the gold. For you. For this." She gestured between them. "I know you lost people you loved. I know that pain doesn't just disappear because good things happen. But Marcus, you're allowed to be happy again. You're allowed to live." Marcus felt tears prickling his eyes. "I don't know if I remember how." "Then let me help you remember." She reached across the table and took his hand. And in that simple touch, Marcus felt something he'd thought was dead forever. Possibility. They took it slow. Dinners, walks, long conversations about the past, and careful explorations of what the future might hold. Mia approved enthusiastically, which helped. She'd started calling Marcus her bonus dad, with a grin that made his heart ache in the best possible way. He told Sarah about Emily and Sophie. Not just the facts of their deaths, but the memories that kept them alive. The way Emily had sung off-key in the kitchen. The way Sophie had insisted on wearing her princess dress to the hardware store. The guilt that had driven him into the mountains, and the slow healing that was bringing him back. Sarah listened, without judgment. She shared her own story. The husband who'd left when Mia was 2, the years of struggling alone, the fear that she'd never be enough for her daughter. They traded scars and discovered that broken things could still hold together, still be beautiful, still work. 2 years after finding the gold, Marcus stood at the opening of the Pine Ridge Historical Museum. The building had been constructed on the site of an old mining office, incorporating original materials with modern design. Inside, the story of the Consolidated Mining Company, the lost gold, and the town's revival was told through photographs, artifacts, and interactive displays. Several of the original gold bars were on display behind security glass, along with the tools and documents Marcus had found in the cave. But the most powerful exhibit was a video installation where townspeople told their stories. Betty, talking about keeping the diner open when she had $3 in her bank account. Frank, describing the day his son called to say he was moving back to Pine Ridge. Margaret explaining how she'd taught in a classroom with no heat and broken windows because she believed in her students. Mia, now 15, and articulate beyond her years, describing what it meant to have a future instead of just survival. And Sarah, explaining how a desperate single mother had met a broken mountain man, and together they'd helped rebuild not just a town but themselves. The museum opened to overflow crowds. Tourists came from across the country to see the gold and hear the story. But more importantly, schoolchildren from Pine Ridge walked through those halls and learned that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they believed in each other. Marcus gave a short speech at the opening. He kept it simple, thanking the people who'd supported him, honoring the memories of those who'd hidden the gold 147 years ago, and expressing hope for what Pine Ridge would become. But what he didn't say, what he saved for later that night when it was just him and Sarah sitting on his porch watching the stars, was more important. "I thought the gold was the treasure," he said. "That's what I told myself when I first found it. That discovering $300 million was the miracle. But I was wrong." Sarah leaned against him. "What was the treasure?" "This. All of this. The community that formed around an impossible discovery. The people who risked their safety to protect it. The kids who now believe they can be anything. You and Mia. The fact that I'm sitting here talking to someone, instead of hiding alone in a cabin." He paused. The treasure was remembering how to be human again. Sarah kissed him. It was soft and certain, and promised tomorrows that Marcus had stopped believing in 7 years ago. "I love you," she said. Marcus had thought those words were buried with Emily, that he'd never say them or hear them again. But sitting there with Sarah, in the town he'd helped save, in the life he'd helped build, he found they came easily. "I love you too." 3 years after the discovery, Pine Ridge held its first annual Mountain Heritage Festival. 5,000 people descended on the town for a weekend of music, food, history tours, and celebration. Marcus stood on the stage during the opening ceremony, looking out at a sea of faces. The festival was being held in Heritage Park, a 20-acre green space developed with trust funds. It featured hiking trails, picnic areas, an amphitheater, and a memorial wall honoring the pioneers who'd built this region. On that wall, they'd added names: Emily Hayes and Sophie Hayes, beloved wife and daughter of Marcus Hayes, gone but never forgotten. Marcus visited the memorial often. He'd bring flowers, he'd tell them about his day, about the town, about Sarah and Mia. He'd apologize for disappearing into the mountains for 7 years, and he'd thank them for the time they'd had. Brief as it was, the grief never completely disappeared, but it transformed from something that crushed him into something he could carry, a weight that reminded him what love cost and why it was still worth it. Sarah joined him on stage for the festival dedication. So did Mia, who'd won a scholarship to a pre-med program and would be leaving for college in the fall. So did Frank, Margaret, Betty, Tom, and Patricia, the people who'd stood together when everything could have fallen apart. Mayor Tucker, who'd initially been skeptical of the whole endeavor, spoke about how Pine Ridge had gone from a dying town to a model for rural revitalization. State officials praised the trust's transparent management. Federal representatives acknowledged that sometimes letting communities control their own destinies produced better outcomes than government bureaucracy. But the most powerful moment came when a young girl, maybe 8 years old, approached the microphone during the open comment period. "My name is Emma," she said, voice small but determined. "My family moved here last year because my mom heard there were jobs and good schools. Before we came here, we lived in our car. Now, we have a house. I have my own room. I go to a school with a library and a playground. And I just want to say thank you. Thank you for making a place where people like us can have a home." There wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. That night, after the festival crowds had dispersed and the town settled into quiet, Marcus walked the streets of Pine Ridge. Lights glowed warm in windows. Children's laughter echoed from backyards. The smell of dinner cooking drifted on the evening air. This was what $312 million in gold had bought. Not mansions or yachts or personal fortune, but life, community, hope, second chances for people who thought their stories were over. Marcus's phone buzzed. A text from Sarah. "Come home. Mia made dessert, and we're waiting for you. Home." The word still felt foreign sometimes, but less so every day. He turned toward Maple Street, toward the house with the porch light on, toward the people who'd become his family, toward the future he'd stopped believing in and somehow found again. Behind him, the mountains rose dark against the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, in a sealed cave now preserved for history, was the place where everything had changed, where a man who'd given up on the world had broken through stone and found not just gold, but a reason to live again. The cave was empty now, the gold secured and allocated and transformed into schools and hospitals and businesses and dreams. But Marcus understood that the real treasure had never been the metal bars stacked in the darkness. It had been the journey from isolation to connection, from despair to purpose, from survival to actually living. And as he walked home through the streets of the town he'd helped save, Marcus Hayes knew with absolute certainty that he'd never been richer. Because anyone can find gold if they're lucky. But finding yourself again after you've been lost, finding love after loss, purpose after despair, community after isolation. That's the miracle. That's the treasure that can't be measured in dollars or weighed in ounces. That's the fortune worth more than any cave could ever hold. Marcus reached his front door. Inside, he could hear Mia telling Sarah an animated story about her biology class. He could smell chocolate cake. He could see the warm light spilling onto the porch, inviting him in. He stood there for just a moment, breathing in the mountain air, feeling the weight of gold replaced by the lightness of grace. Then he opened the door and stepped inside, into the warmth, into the noise, into the beautiful chaos of a life rebuilt from ruins, into home, the end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will move you. Click now to keep discovering with us, and hit subscribe if you believe that sometimes the greatest treasures are the ones that save us from ourselves.